Hi, Camilo.
Hello.
Hi. So we have Camilo from both University of Iceland and University of Aveiro, Portugal, for presenting us about the annual cycles of whimbrels.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jeannie, for the introduction. Yeah, I am currently a postdoctoral researcher at the South Iceland Research Center, but I will actually show you some of the findings made during my PhD when I was looking at several aspects along the annual cycle of Icelandic whimbrels. And during my PhD, I was supervised by Thomas Gunnarsson and Jose Alves, so all of what I will show has their strong contribution. To start with some context, whimbrels breed mostly in the subarctic and tend to winter along coastal areas of temperate and tropical regions. They are found in pretty much all the flyways, as well, in the flyways in the east, such as we saw from David's talk. I will talk about those using the East Atlantic flyway, and particularly about the Icelandic subspecies. As you can probably figure out, they mostly breed in Iceland, but they spend the winter mostly in West Africa. We started getting more interested in these birds and their migration and other aspects of the annual cycle after Jose Alves and colleagues conducted a pilot study where they tracked successfully 4 birds, and they found that in autumn, they all flew non-stop from Iceland to West Africa to spend the winter, performing a flight of 6,000 kilometers over the ocean. More interestingly, at least for me, was what they found in spring migration. They found that 2 of those birds did the reverse, so a direct flight towards the breeding sites, whereas the other 2 performed a flight to Ireland, made a stop over there, and then moved to Iceland. So it was not only clear immediately 2 different routes, but it was also clear among these 4 birds differences in spring arrival timing, which can be an important annual stage. It was also clear some variation in the wintering location, and naturally that meant different distances of migration. So with only these 4 birds, it was possible to see considerable annual variation, and we started wondering if such variation can have different fitness consequences. And so that's more or less when I started doing my PhD and collecting more data to try to tackle some of those points. The data was collected throughout the year, but mostly during the breeding season, where the nests were found and the laying dates and clutch sizes recorded. The nests were monitored to record the fledging success of all the pairs. Adult birds were caught and individually marked with colorings because we were also interested in following the same individuals over multiple years, and some of them were tracked with geolocators. David already mentioned these devices, but in case someone tuned in afterwards, they are very small tracking devices which record the light intensity continuously, and together with the timestamp, it's possible to estimate or to infer the geographical positions of individuals. So basically with geolocators, we could know where birds are outside of Iceland and when they perform their movements. The data collection extended further south to the wintering sites, where I was basically looking at whimbrels for many hours and recording their foraging behavior in order to measure their energetic balance. So having all of this information on our desks, we could then start answering some questions. And we started by asking what are their migration routes and wintering and stopover sites, since we now had a larger data set since the pilot study. We could confirm what was found during the pilot study, that in autumn, all the birds fly directly to the wintering sites. However, since this figure was produced, we obviously continue tracking more birds, and we already found a couple of them stopping in autumn, but nevertheless, the figure is about 100%. The main wintering areas are indeed in West Africa, but after tracking more and more birds, we found birds wintering further north up to the Iberian Peninsula. We did find a slightly different story since the pilot study for spring migration, because actually more often than not, whimbrels tend to stop on their way to Iceland. Their stopover areas tend to be in Ireland or the UK, but they extend from the Iberian Peninsula up to the Netherlands. We then asked if there are any seasonal differences in migration duration and speed. And to calculate their migration duration, we took into account the first fueling period by estimating how long individuals would take to fuel for the following flight. We found that whimbrels have shorter migration duration in autumn than in spring, and similarly, their migration speed is higher in autumn than in spring. Such faster autumn migration is not common, and of course we have some ideas of why this could be the case. Well, one could be that perhaps wind conditions are different between the two seasons, and therefore that will affect the speeds differently. It could be that in spring whimbrels stop and therefore add to the duration of migration, because they need to assess the weather conditions in Iceland before they make the final move, and by doing so they could reduce the probability of finding inclement weather early in the season. Similarly, it could be that the stopover allows individuals to improve their body condition at faster rates than in Iceland, and by arriving in better body condition, they might be able to outcompete conspecifics, or in the case of females, they could bring resources to help with the egg production. It could also be that faster autumn migration arises because of the pressure for individuals to arrive early at the wintering area, and therefore acquire or maintain high quality wintering territories. I will come back to some of these points later on, but first I would like to show you how much the conditions can vary along the wintering distribution. So for the winter side part, the fieldwork was conducted at 3 wintering sites in the Bijagos archipelago in Guinea-Bissau, in the Bantarga in Mauritania, and in the Tejo estuary in Portugal. These 3 sites are obviously at different distances from Iceland, but they are also located at different bioclimatic regions. The Bijagos is located in the tropical region, Bantarga in the arid region, and in the Tejo, the climate is temperate. At each of these sites, I conducted several focal observations to record foraging behavior and time budgets, which allows to calculate the energetic intake of whimbrels, which together with the thermoregulatory costs allow us to calculate their energetic balance. What we found was that in the Bijagos, the energetic balance is higher than in the Bantarga, and in the Bantarga, the birds reach energetic balance higher than in Tejo. We also calculated the migration costs between Iceland and each of these sites, and as expected, the costs are higher to migrate to places further away than to places closer. Having these two bits together, then it seems that whimbrels trade off the migration costs by wintering in places with higher energetic surplus. And so we started wondering if such energetic surplus can have other effects throughout the year, and if this can carry over into the breeding sites. Just in case someone is not familiar with carryover effects, these are essentially, well, they occur when the performance or the conditions of individuals can be explained or is affected by what they experienced previously. And to investigate if wintering conditions might affect them in the breeding sites, we compared the laying dates of females which wintered at each of those 3 sites. We decided to look at the laying dates because often in the literature it's mentioned that the breeding success of individuals can vary with the date when they start breeding or they lay their clutches. So we went to check that relationship for our population, and we found that indeed Icelandic whimbrels tend to have a higher probability of being successful breeders if they lay their clutches earlier. So we could expect that if there are any effects from the wintering conditions, perhaps birds in a better place, apparently better place, such as in the Bijagos, could possibly lay their clutches earlier. But that's actually, well, we didn't find evidence for that. So we didn't find any differences between the laying dates of females wintering at each of those sites. As you can see, the sample sizes are not balanced, and we only have 3 data points for females wintering in Tej. Well, which is unfortunate, but also not unexpected, because actually the bulk of the birds winter in the Bijagos, and then towards the edge of the wintering distribution, we get less and less birds. Of course, even if we don't find any effects or positive effects at the breeding sites coming from the wintering locations, it doesn't mean that spending the winter in a place like in the Bijagos with a higher energetic surplus do not have advantages. Perhaps by having more energy available, whimbrels can perform their complete feather molt faster, and they could also possibly be able to fuel up for spring migration at a faster rate, and therefore reduce the duration of that period. Because whimbrels are long-lived individuals, we were also interested in how consistent they are throughout the year, and in particularly during migration. And starting by looking at their use of these 2 different routes, the direct flight or the stopover one, we managed to track 12 individuals over multiple springs, and out of those 12, 3 of them changed between these 2 behaviors. But what's more interesting, at least in my opinion, is that all of those 3 birds that changed, they only changed in one direction, from making a direct flight to making a stopover flight. And these birds, they were tracked not only in 2 years. So after they changed, they kept doing the stopover flights. In terms of timings, I will show you the mean individual range, which is essentially the difference between the maximum and the minimum individual timing for each stage, averaged across the sample. And what we found was that individuals tend to be consistent on their timings over the years, and they tend to depart within a window of about 9 days from the breeding grounds. The variation is pretty much the same at the arrival, because they make the direct flight that I showed before, so this is totally expected. In spring, they tend to show a higher consistency on their timings, particularly in spring. They tend to, particularly at departure, they tend to leave within a window of about 4 days. Their arrival is slightly more variable, which is also expected, because if they are consistent at departure, but then can take one or the other routes, then it's expected that at the arrival, there will be higher variation. We got increasingly more intrigued about these two behaviors. So we took a while to try to investigate what is driving these two behaviors. And we tested three ideas. First we thought that perhaps are the conditions that the birds experience during the first part of the flight that make them stop or not. So if these conditions are favorable, then they would continue towards Iceland, and if it was a difficult journey, then they would stop. To look into that, we calculated the average air-to-ground speed ratio, which essentially informs on the wind support or wind impediment during the route. And then we compared how that looks like for birds that would make a stopover and birds that would continue towards Iceland. We didn't see any differences between the two groups, suggesting that this might not be what is triggering them to stop or continue. We thought that perhaps could be something that not what they experienced until they reached this region, but for example, the conditions they experience at this region. So we looked at how the temperature compares, thinking that perhaps if the temperature is higher, it could indicate better conditions as well ahead in the breeding sites, and therefore continue. And if the temperature would be lower, they would be more likely to stop. But again, we didn't see differences in the temperature experienced at this latitude between the two groups. We then thought that perhaps it's still wind, but could be maybe the westerly winds pushing birds to stop in certain occasions and allowing them to keep going in other occasions. So we compared how the zonal wind looks like for birds that make the direct flight and birds that will make a stop. And once again, we failed to find any differences between these two groups. And so if it doesn't seem to be what they experience during flight, we thought that perhaps it's something at departure or before departure. And so we looked at how the departure date for the two groups compared. And here we saw that birds that make a stopover tend to depart earlier compared to those that make a direct flight, which tend to depart later from the wintering sites. We thought that this possibly suggests a pressure for late birds to get into the breeding sites quick, and therefore skip making a stopover. And as we saw before, it may be important to not be late, because at least for the laying date, if they lay too late, then the probability of being successful is lower. But of course, we need to make the link between arrival and laying date. So we looked at the relationship between arrival date and laying date, and we saw a positive relationship. So there's a tendency for early arriving birds to also lay their clutches earlier. And it's actually clear that birds that make a direct flight arrive earlier than those that make a stopover. But actually the laying date between the two groups completely overlaps. So it's not really clear that by making a direct flight, individuals actually take advantage of that, and in terms of laying dates. So there isn't a clear evidence of an advantage of making the direct flight. And as we saw, there is also no clear differences in weather conditions during spring migration, which then made us wonder why, if it's so, why is it so common that birds make a stopover? And we think that this could happen if birds stop in order to fine-tune their timing of arrival at the breeding sites. And to check for that, for that possibility, we compared how the temperature in the breeding site correlates with the temperature at the stopover site at time of departure. And we saw that the two tend to be correlated. So when whimbrels are at their stopover site, if the temperature, the temperature that they are experienced tends to be correlated with the temperature in their breeding sites. And therefore they might be able to use this information to move into Iceland when they consider the conditions are favorable, and therefore reduce the possibility of finding inclement weather in Iceland at arrival. And that's it. And I reckon that it might have been too much information in about 20 minutes or so. But if there is anything that you need to memorize from this talk, is that Icelandic whimbrels tend to migrate faster in autumn than in spring, and in spring migration they often make a stopover on their way to Iceland. They achieve higher positive, a more positive energetic balance in the Bísí in their main wintering area, which is also located further from Iceland, and we didn't detect any carryover effects from the wintering conditions into the breeding sites. Icelandic whimbrels are consistent on their timings of migration, and particularly when they depart from the wintering sites. And we think that they make a stopover in spring to essentially adjust their timing of arrival into Iceland. And that's it. But before I stop speaking, I would like to thank the funding agencies that allowed for this work to be done. My colleagues and everyone who, in one way or another, helped to get these results, and also Jeannie and the East Asian Australasian Flyway tracking shorebird group for allowing me to share these results with you, and of course everyone for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for your nice talk. It's very interesting, very good results. And in the chat, I also share the links to the papers that Camilo has published about that was mentioned in the talk. So if anyone is interested, take a look. So are there any questions from the audience? Let me check. Yes, there is a question from Professor Jijun Ma. Thanks for the nice talk. Are there some difference in migration performance between males and females?
Yeah, the short answer is no. At least as far as we looked into in terms of distances and migration duration, we didn't see differences between males and females. There are differences in timings. So males tend to leave from the breeding grounds later than the females. Of course, these differences are not striking, but on average, they tend to leave in autumn later than the females, but they tend to be earlier than the females in spring.
Thank you. Yeah, there are other questions from the audience. I didn't see anyone raise their hand yet, so.
Well, but I may say that if anyone even has a question, I don't know, later, yeah, please feel free to contact.
Yes, that would be great. So maybe I have a question now. Do you calculate, or do you know if the birds from wintering in Africa, like, are they all have the amount of energy that is enough for making a direct flight to Iceland?
Yes, it's they should all have enough energy available to fly directly to Iceland. But it's it's a bit of my guess, because the data collected was during the winter, not getting into the fueling part of migration. And it was I was only measuring their intake, so I didn't really record the food availability, which I think would be well necessary to really give you a proper answer. But yeah, but my guess is that they likely have enough available to make a direct flight if they want.
Yeah. I see. Okay, Misha has a question. Hi.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. Sorry to ask a question of both speakers, but since there wasn't any other hands, I thought I would ask. I'm a researcher in the East Asian Australasian flyway, and one thing that really interests me is shorebirds using artificial habitats. For example, here we have a lot of fish ponds that are important habitats, and we do associate whimbrel with some agricultural habitats. So I was wondering if in any of the stopover sites you're familiar with, or in the wintering sites in Iceland, whether whimbrel are using agricultural areas for habitat. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. So where do whimbrels breed in Iceland? It's actually, well, they tend to prefer natural habitats, but they are close to farmland. But it's anyway not intensive farming practices there. So there is always semi-natural habitat around anyway. As for the wintering grounds, they mostly use mudflats and mangrove areas. I don't know if they use man-made habitats as well. And during stopover, they do use, I think they do use agricultural land as well. They do not only stop along the coasts, sometimes they stop, very much inland on fields, as it seems, but I didn't look much into that to actually know how much they use each type of habitat. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
From my side, but maybe David can, of course, talk about the birds on the other side.
Yeah, I was interested in your flyway. I think that's consistent, like the idea that they are using those habitats maybe quite a bit in stopover, but not as much on the breeding areas or non-breeding areas. So that's very interesting. Thanks.
Thanks. David, I have a question.
Thanks a lot, Camilo. Very interesting talk. I think what the whimbrel do differently between your flyway and our flyway is the timing of migration, because our study in the East Asian Australasian flyway has shown whimbrel go faster to the breeding ground and come back and take time, because I think to rush fall. So that's why some of the bird actually came back in November or December, so it cannot take time. It's quite interesting that bird that attacked from Iceland has shown a different way. So what I can probably feel because I'm not sure how site fidelity works in the study area you do for both wintering, particular wintering area, but in a bird that we study, they are extremely site fidelity here. So I just wonder it may not be the main study area you deal with. Would that be the most important factor why the bird actually just decide after breeding, after spending all the energy, but go back to wintering ground straight away rather than take time to do that? Or is that because they're lacking of I cannot say lacking of stopover they do during spring migration. So it's just very interesting.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, of course. I think we tend to think much more of the importance of breeding and birds, and for birds to maintain their breeding sites and be there to defend it and so on. But yeah, as you were mentioning, it could happen the other way around, or it could also happen the other way around. What I mean is that, perhaps they really need to be in the wintering sites to make sure that their territory will be theirs, sort of say. So yeah, it could be that there is also some pressure, and therefore they have to move faster. Well, as far as I know, they are site faithful to the wintering territory too. So that could play like that as well. I don't know if I'm replying to your question or not.
Oh, that's all right. I think there's a lot of questions probably meant to be better answered for future. There's a lot of things we don't know about the bird. It's just quite amazing. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And do you think there are more birds doing direct flights in the past in spring migration than now? Because in the pilot study, there's actually like half of the birds, but although there's only 4 birds.
Yes. I think, well, of course, it's difficult to see year variation with a big sample size. Of course, it's some years together, but I don't think we have, for the years where there were enough birds, I don't think there was any evidence for that. But yeah, it could be indeed that in some, maybe that was the odd year when the pilot study was done, and so they actually got, and they also got the 4 odd birds where 2 would do it. But yeah, I really don't know. But I would expect that. Yeah, it could be, as you say, indeed, if the conditions now tend to be more stochastic, maybe it makes more sense to stop than before, although before perhaps the conditions early in the season were also more unfavorable, even if the variation wasn't so high. Yeah, I don't know.
I see. Yeah, or maybe is there like observations in the stopover sites about like maybe counts of whimbrels, like if the numbers have changed through time over, like, I mean, from past to current times. I don't know if you know something about that, or like
I didn't understand the first part that you said.
Yeah, I was wondering maybe one way to also have a hint on whether there are more birds doing direct flights in the past would be like count of whimbrels at these stopover places. So if you know anything about that. Yeah.
Yes, there is some data from Ireland. At least from Ireland, I know there is some data, and I would expect from the whole UK, there is some data. And yes, maybe it would be a way to at least have another clue. But there is also another thing, which is birds going, well, they nominate subspecies, not going to Iceland, but going to Scandinavia and Russia. They probably also use the UK. So that would complicate a bit. And then, of course, we would, I think, also need to take into account the population size over time, so it's a lot of uncertainty there as well. But it's a good idea to at least have a look and have more clues and more questions, basically.
Yeah. I think that this changes, or like this different strategy is very interesting, and it's like, yeah, just how is it come about? Yeah. So yeah, and Yeah, and I have one last question. Just, are there more birds wintering in Spain, Portugal nowadays than before? Or like, because you show now there's like 3 birds, 4 birds doing that out of like a minority.
Mm-hmm. You mean if I have more samples from there?
Yeah, or are they generally increasing because a lot of migrants are shortening their migration?
Yeah, I don't think there is evidence for more birds wintering there. Well, and also I don't have more samples here. Well, I stopped collecting those samples as well. So yeah, I don't have more. But yeah, but basically to get 3 more samples from Tej, for example, that will mean getting 100 more from or something like that from the Bijagos. So yeah, so we will need to collect really a lot of samples to just increase that group a bit. Yeah, it's unfortunate, and yeah, it's not so good for data analysis, but it's what it is.
Yeah, yeah. So there is some question at the chat. There's a question from Chang Chuyu. I wonder if you tagged whimbrels of different age groups, and are there any differences in their migration patterns?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. So all the birds that I talked about, they were breeding birds, so they were all adults. Well, naturally, they can be of different ages. Yeah, perhaps some were 5 years old and others 10 years old, and that's actually something that could also explain these differences in spring migration. And particularly, although it's only 3 birds that change their migration, the fact that they change from a direct flight to a stopover flight, which seems more, well, it seems safer than a direct flight. Well, that together to the fact that in autumn, adults, and now we know that juveniles as well, migrate directly. Well, that makes us think that perhaps when they do their first spring migrations, they still don't know the possibility of stopping. So what they know is ocean between Iceland and West Africa. So if they are young birds, they possibly try to do the reverse. But perhaps at some point they actually join a group of more experienced birds and then stop, and then they know about that and keep doing so. Well, it's, yeah. So we might actually be tracking different aged birds, but we don't know. We just know that they are adults. They're not, immatures or juveniles. In this data set.
Maybe I could add on to this question, if you don't mind, because
of course not.
Thank you. So with the study we did, there was 2 juvenile residents from the geolocator study. We actually got one we captured, and the bird did not undertake a full migration. It's reached somewhere in Thailand. Then with the whimbrel we tagged, we knew some 2nd-year birds, so they actually did not complete a full migration route. They reached halfway to the migration. One bird reached to Myanmar, another bird reached to Vietnam, so decide to return without further migration. Then, unfortunately, the bird reached to Myanmar, did not carry on another migration next year, while the bird that stopped at Vietnam has carried out the full migration to Russia Far East afterward. So basically, what we understand is some of the juvenile or even 2nd-year bird may not complete a migration.
Okay.
Full migration.
Yes, thank you. Yes, and so it seems that they actually kind of try a bit, come back, and then until the point that they are able to perform the full migration and try to breathe.
Yeah, with a very small sample, we cannot, conclude the strategy, but assume they are doing it. I think there was a lot of what you got with tracking now is being focused in New Zealand. That probably will be able to tell more clearly on how this juvenile or young adults migrate.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yes. Thanks. Yeah. I think the talk given by Phil Batley last summer in our webinar series showed that these juveniles, they do like migration, but like not all the way to the breeding grounds in the second or the third year of their life. So I think I see some thank you from the chat. So thanks a lot, Camilo, for your nice talk. Very, very nice results, and I hope more will come in your current work, and we can hear about them soon. Wish you all the best in the tracking and in your work, and also with David. Thanks a lot, and I hope to hear your new findings soon. And thanks everyone for attending this webinar. And we will have a recording on YouTube and you can share with your network. And if you are interested in the work of the speakers, feel free to contact them, and their published papers are in the chat. So thank you everyone, and bye.